Okay, so in today's session, we will discuss about documenting software architecture. So this every application or every software that we develop will have a representation in the form of architecture. So it will have modules, it will have components, it will have connectors, and we will allocate such architecture modules to the environment, that is environment related elements. So for every architecture that we develop or every architecture that we have for the application will be documented. Yes, will be documented. So we are going to see how it is being documented and what are the different ways in which it can be viewed, and who will be using this documentation and what purpose we are documenting the architecture. So usually creating just an architecture, it is not enough. So we have to document those architectures in such a way that it is communicating to the stakeholders, and whether they can understand everything is involved when you document the architecture. So even if you are not specifying or not communicating properly the architecture, the documentation will do the job. So the documentation process is more important, like you design your architecture for your system. So you have a system, you will have an architecture for the system, and that architecture is to be documented so that it can communicate to the stakeholders in a proper way. So if you are going to design an architecture and if you are going to give a good documentation means, so it will be very easy for the other person who is coming new to the application or new to the software architecture, they can understand easily. So even if you put 1,000 words and explain the architecture, the documentation, if it is very simple, they can easily understand what that particular architecture. By that they can understand the application as well. Okay, so the users and audience for the architecture documentations. As I told you, the architecture and the documentation for that architecture can be used by some of the people. So that is what we are going to discuss it now. So it is having various purposes. For the particular architecture is having various purposes for its emerge. And first, it should be sufficiently transparent and accessible to be quickly understood by the new employee, as I told earlier. So if you are a new person to that particular application, you will be given with an architecture. So that new person should understand that architecture very easily by seeing the documentation for that particular architecture. It should be very transparent and accessible and quickly understood. So it should not have very complicated terms, complex terms. It should be very layman explanation of how the application is working. It should be sufficiently concrete to serve as a blueprint. So it is like a blueprint for the applications that you are having in hand. Next, it should have enough information to serve as a basis for analysis. So documentation should start with the basics so that they can give their own analysis on that particular application. So it should not have like a very gist of what the particular application does or gist of the architecture that you have designed. It should have each and every concept of the particular architecture. Okay, so the architecture can be of both perspective and descriptive. So for some people, for some audience means, for some stakeholders, it can be a descriptive one. For some stakeholders, it can be an prescriptive one. So for some audience, it prescribes what should be true, and for someone, you should tell how it is done. So it differs person to person. It gets differs. For the first audience, it prescribes what should be true, placing constraints on decision yet to be made. You have to give the decisions on their hand, stating that this would be true. For the other audience, you have to tell what it is, and you have to tell them the decision is already been made and how it can be recounted. Like that, you have to be for some person, if you are going to give a prescriptive document, that will be useful. For some, you have to describe something and you have to tell them. So they cannot take decisions on their own and on their own. So they have to be given with what is right and what is wrong. For some very experienced person means they can just understand what is what and they can do. So why we are having two types of documentation, prescriptive and descriptive. So the next one is we are just going to see how these architectures can be used in three ways. So it means for the education, and it is for the communication among the stakeholders, and it is for the base for constructing more on that particular architecture. So if it is an education, as a point says, the educational use consists of introducing people to the system, and the people may a new member or a team or external see. Oh, it means of education means knowledge transfer. So by the architecture documentation, you are transferring the knowledge from one to the other. So they can be the person who is in the other end, they can be a new member or already an experienced person or totally out of the company, or he can be a new fresh new architect. So for all those people or all those stakeholders, your documentation will be as an education tool. Okay, it may in many cases a new person is a customer to whom you are showing a solution at the first time. Maybe the customer itself be the end user, so for them only you will be developing the application. So the other end, the stakeholders may be the end user, or the stakeholders may be the company people. We may not know who will be using the architecture documentation. So it is a communication, it is a communication, because we cannot everyone cannot understand the application, everyone cannot understand the software. Some may understand architecture, some may understand documentation. If some of them can understand with the diagram representation, some of them can understand with the documentation. So each and everyone is having their own understanding, their own way of getting things. So it is a communication among the stakeholders. For example, if we take software, the stakeholders may be the developer, the tester, the end users, the company people, the management people. They are all the stakeholders. How the architecture is going to be served as a communication tool among the stakeholders. So that was the one. And other for analyzing and constructing. So usually the architecture will tell what is to implement. See, the architecture tell implementers what to implement. So usually it will tell what to implement and what are the different modules we have, and how these modules has been provided, and which are the modules as we are using it. See, every module has interface that must be provided and uses interface from other modules. Either we have to provide the module, or we will be using the module from the other we will be taking help from the other modules. So not only providing or using, everything has to be determined, it has to be developed in a such a way that it is communicating well with the other modules. See, the architecture tells implementers what to implement, and every module will have an interface. That interface either we have to provide, or we have to take it from the other module. So not only providing this one, it also gives the instruction how to provide, where to use, and everything. So during development, the architecture can be very complex. So if the application is complex, in turn, obviously, the implementing architecture will also be a complex, and many issues will be there to resolve. So documentation will be very useful for when we go for the first time. It is very useful. When it is go the next or the other levels, it will be much easier. You can overlook the other issues that we faced earlier. And it also for the system builders who use automatic code generation, the document may incorporate models used for generations. Yes, the documentation. For if the application is automatic code generation, it can also have the earlier, the already used codes or documentation we can incorporate, so that the one who is developing now may have an influence with all those things. So that is what the documentation of analysis and construction. So notations. So we are discussed about how the documentation should be, who will be using it, and this is the notation. So you have three types of notation to just represent the architecture. One is informal and semi-formal and formal. So informal means the views will be graphically, I mean the architecture will be very graphical, and they will use the general notations, general editing tools. Like example, you can take presentation, PPT presentation. PowerPoint presentation is like informal notations. If it is a semi-formal, you will be using standardized notations, like your unified modeling language. They will have a graphical elements. You will have some rules and constraints for constructing those architecture, and we may not get a complete structure of the entire elements or entire architecture, but you will be putting with a standardized notation so that it can just replicate what the application has been done for. Next is formal notation. The notation will be very precise, and it will have all the syntax, all the semantics, all the structures and the meaning, everything will be there, and it will have varieties of notations. And what are the things we discussed already is architecture description, a language weaves a language, and drifts language. These are the examples for formal notations. So they will have the entire explanation, but still it will stick on to the formal notations that they use. They will have some specific notations to be followed by each and every. We have extensive ADL, we have specific ADL, we have domain specific ADL. So every ADL will have their own representation. Accordingly, we have to design the documentation. Okay, so we discussed about what is documenting the architecture, why we are documenting, and who will be documenting, who will be using this documentation and all. So we ended up with what are the notations that we use. Usually we will use informal, semi-formal, and formal notations. Thank you.